Okay. Well, welcome everybody. This is Betsy Martin, Chair of the Exception Review Committee. And we have to start with some kind of bureaucratic procedure here. And I have to read a script that's prepared by the county attorney. So bear with me. To conduct this meeting wholly electronically and to effectuate both the emergency procedures authorized by FOIA and the emergency ordinance, the Exception Review Committee needs to make certain findings and determinations for the record. It's a bit cumbersome, so I ask you in advance for your patience. First, because each member of the Exception Review Committee is participating in this meeting from a separate location, we must verify that a quorum of members is participating and that each member's voice is clear, audible, and at an appropriate volume for all the other members. Accordingly, I'm going to conduct a roll call and ask each Exception Review Committee member participating in this meeting to state your name, which district you represent, and the location from which you're participating. I ask that each of you pay close attention to ensure that you can hear each of your colleagues. Following this roll call, we will vote to establish that every member can hear every other member. So I'm Betsy Martin, representing the Mount Vernon District, and I'm in Fairfax County, Virginia. So next, perhaps next on my here is Ed Monroe.
Yes, good afternoon. This is Ed Monroe. I'm representing the Drainsville District, and I'm also in Fairfax County, Virginia.
Okay, thank you, Ed. Amy? Your name and your what district you're representing? Sorry. You're representing Braddock. Okay, thank you. And Ann?
I'm Ann Cantor, and I'm in Fairfax, McLean, Virginia, and I'm an at-large appointee.
Thank you. Okay, how about next would be David Schneer.
This is David Schneer. I'm in Burke, Virginia, the heart and soul of Fairfax County. I represent Springfield, Virginia.
Thank you. Ken?
Hi, this is Ken Lanfear, representing Hunter Mill. I'm in my apartment high above Reston, and glad to be here.
Thank you. Sam Govender?
It is Sam Govender from Sully District. I'm in Fairfax, Virginia.
Okay, and Sue Schumann?
Hi, this is Sue Schumann. I represent this district, and I'm in Fairfax in Nashua, the best neighborhood in Virginia.
And Jim Chesley? Jim, are you there?
Sorry, one moment. I have to unmute him again. He's in the attendees list, so let me just do that. Okay, go ahead, Jim.
This is Jim Chesley. I'm at large, and I'm somewhere on Route 222 in Pennsylvania.
Oh. And I see we have Alexis Dickerson is here, has joined us. Alexis, would you tell us your name, where you are physically, and your district you're representing, please?
Sure. I'm Alexis Dickerson. I live on Telegraph Road in Virginia Hills, and I'm representing the Lee District.
Thank you, and welcome to the Exception Review Committee.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so that's everybody. We have, everybody is here. Okay, next. At this point, I will pass the virtual gavel to the Vice Chairman, Ed Monroe, so that I may be heard to make the requisite motion. I move that each member's voice may be adequately heard by each other member of the Exception Review Committee. Can I hear a second to that motion?
Dave Schneer, I'll second.
Okay, thank you. I confirm that David Schneer seconded the motion. The motion is moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? Hearing and seeing none. All those in favor say aye. And I guess we'll have to take 30 seconds for everybody to unmute themselves before they can say aye.
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 Aye. All opposed, nay? Any nays? Okay, the ayes have it and the motion carries. Second, having established that each member's voice may be heard by every other member, we must next establish the nature of the emergency that compels these emergency procedures. The fact that we are meeting electronically, what type of electronic communication is being used, and how we've arranged for public access to this meeting. Therefore, I move that the state of emergency caused by the COVID-19 pandemic makes it unsafe for the Exception Review Committee to physically assemble and unsafe for the public to physically attend any such meeting, and that as such, FOIA's usual procedures, which require the physical assembly of the Exception Review Committee and the physical presence of the public, cannot be implemented safely or practically. I further move that the Exception Review Committee may conduct this meeting electronically through a dedicated video conferencing platform, Cisco WebEx, and that the public may access this meeting by calling 1-844-621-3956 and entering access code 173-999-7180. Do I hear a second?
Second.
Okay, I confirm that Amy Gould has seconded the motion. The motion is moved and seconded.
I believe it was Ann.
Oh, it was Ann Cantor. Sorry, I didn't recognize your voice, Ann. Is there any discussion? Okay, hearing and seeing none. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed say nay. Okay, the ayes have it and the motion carries. All right, we're almost done. Finally, it is next required that all of the matters addressed on today's agenda must address the emergency itself, are necessary for continuity in Fairfax County government, and or are statutorily required or necessary to continue operations and the discharge of the Exception Review Committee's lawful purposes, duties, and responsibilities. Is there anybody who takes exception to any of the notion that any of our purposes at today's meeting are not necessary or statutorily required or necessary for us to operate and discharge our duties? Okay, so if there's no discussion, I move to approve the electronic meeting policy related to the agenda item for December 2nd, 2020, distributed prior to this meeting that allows for the ERC to meet electronically going forward. I confirm, I guess I need to hear a second to that.
Second.
Who was that? Sue?
Yes.
Okay. I confirm that Sue Kovacs Schumann seconded the motion. So the motion is moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? Hearing and seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed say nay. Okay, the ayes have it and the motion carries. And now we can begin our actual meeting, I believe. Am I correct, Danielle? But now we actually start our meeting. So the first order of business is to find the agenda. We've reviewed and voted on the proposed electronic meeting policy, and we need to review previous meeting minutes from February 5th, 2020, which was the last time we met. Anybody got any modifications to the minutes? They were very accurate, I thought. Do I hear a motion to approve the minutes?
I move the minutes as submitted.
Okay. A second?
I'll second that.
Okay, so Ann Cantor has moved we approve the minutes, and I think that was Ed Monroe seconded
Yes. Yes.
it. And so the minutes are approved. Oh, first we have to vote. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Anybody opposed? Okay, the first topic, substantive topic, is an update on the Woodlark case presented by Mark Gorey. Mark, if you're there, the rest of us could probably mute. And I'd like to make sure everybody gets a chance to ask questions, but why don't we wait until after each presentation is completed, and then we can have a questions and answer session if people want to, if people have questions.
Okay, thank you. It's good to see everyone. I think there's at least one new member since I would last appeared before the committee. So welcome to the Exception Review Committee. My name is Mark Gorey. I'm an Assistant County Attorney, and from time to time I provide advice to the committee. And today I was asked to review or update the committee on the status of the case that was brought by a former applicant, K2NC LLC, against members of the ERC and the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors. Just for review, the lawsuit was based on the denial of an application for a waiver to encroach in the seaward 50 feet. The ERC denied that application, and then later the board on appeal affirmed the ERC's decision and also rejected the request for an exception. So the applicant, K2NC, filed a lawsuit against the county and also the members of the committee. They alleged that the county acted, both the ERC and the county acted unreasonably, arbitrarily, and capriciously, and that their decision was not fairly debatable. They also claimed that the county engaged in a regulatory taking in violation of their constitutional rights or Virginia constitutional rights, and also that they were deprived of a vested right. The case proceeded through some discovery, and the applicant later came to us and proposed to modify their design, their use of the property to remove all encroachments from outside of the seaward 50 feet. And the trial was originally, I believe, scheduled for May of 2020, was removed from the court's docket indefinitely while the applicant submitted its plans and studies to the county for review and approval. And there really hasn't been a whole lot accomplished since the trial was removed from the docket. Basically, the applicant, through its engineers, has been going back and forth with the county on their floodplain use determination. They would submit an outline of what their survey of the floodplain was going to look like, and the county's engineers went back and forth with their engineers on trying to get all the information that would be needed in order to analyze their impact on the floodplain. So I think we're at a point at which the applicant knows exactly what they need to provide the county in terms of their surveys and their cross sections of the floodplain. and they're currently in the process of putting together their various submissions in order to get the project reviewed and potentially approved. So as I said, the trial is essentially indefinitely postponed until we either make no progress towards approving the application or it doesn't get approved. Or if it does get approved, certainly the lawsuit will be moot. So I don't think I left anything off, but if there are any questions, I'm certainly happy to answer them.
Thank you, Mark.
Mark, this is Ken. I just want to make clear then the design they're proposing now leaves the resource protection area alone.
No, that's not correct. As you recall, the reason why they were before the ERC was because they were proposing to encroach within the seaward 50 feet. Otherwise, the property was almost entirely RPA. So what they're proposing is to build on the property within the RPA, but not within the seaward 50 feet. There will be no encroachment. They're proposing not to perform any encroachments within the seaward 50 feet, but there will be some disturbance in the RPA as a function of the development. It's impossible to develop that property without encroaching into the RPA. And as you know, the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Ordinance allows for lots that were identified before enactment of the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Ordinance to receive exemptions in order to encroach into the RPA. And so the staff that can be approved administratively. And so that's what the property owner is attempting to do. They've considerably scaled back the size of their dwelling. It's basically a double wide. I believe it's only 13. Camlin may be able to help me, but it's a very narrow, if you remember the lot, and the restrictions on the lot, I believe it's a very narrow and elongated structure.
Can they do that and still comply with the setback requirements of the community?
Yes, those are the two things that are working against them, the seaward 50 feet line and the front yard setback.
You're saying that this no longer needs to come before us?
That's correct. At this point, they have not proposed any encroachment into the seaward 50 feet, which would trigger.
I think they had a lot width of 20 to 22 feet at its narrowest point. So that's what they're working with, is something about that wide as a townhouse.
Yeah, I mean, it's not our jurisdiction to say so, but I mean, my opinion as an engineer was that, boy, I wouldn't build a house that close to the floodplain.
Any other questions for Mark Gorey?
Yeah, Mark, can you give us a sense without, I accept the fact that you don't want hypotheticals, inappropriate to necessarily ask you them. There are 3 or 4 more lots downstream that undoubtedly someone's going to want to try to develop if they can get this one developed. And they only get worse. Do you have any sense that we're opening a door here, that we're going to be out the door?
It's hard to say, Dr. Schnare. I believe that the other lots are even less favorable to development if you respect that seaward 50 feet line and also the front yard setback. It becomes increasingly more difficult to build a profitable, I would imagine, a dwelling that is marketable to the public. So I would imagine if I were the owner of this property, K2NC, that I would not be in the market for any more properties in this neighborhood, or at least the vacant lots in that neighborhood.
I would like to say this to our membership. If the resolution is as is proposed and it's approved, it will still be, I think, an important success for our committee. And Ann, you had indicated on more than one occasion that it's not our job to say no, it's our job to find a way to say yes. And I think this is a way that we have gotten to the point that you had so appropriately mentioned in the past.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark.
You're welcome.
With the other lots that you just mentioned, or that were just mentioned, would they also fall into the grandfathered in category?
Yes.
Yes, the subdivision was created, Ms. Dickerson, the subdivision was created, I believe, back in the 1950s, and the lots were subdivided at that point. And yes, they would be eligible for development, provided they satisfy all the other regulations in the zoning ordinance and the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Ordinance.
It's just that, Alexis, there's a community requirement for, I believe, a 70-foot setback from the road. And if you get that setback in place, and at least 2 of those remaining 4, you're already in the 50-foot setback from the creek. So they're just unbuildable.
And Mark, it's nice to meet you. I'm the new member representing Lee District. I just have a question. All of this kind of preceded me, but I'm curious, what is the legal liability of this committee in situations like this, based on the lawsuit that was brought forward?
It was my opinion that the membership was improperly named as party defendants, and that you face no liability, and to the extent that you are sued, the county will represent members of the board.
In addition, and Mark can confirm this either now or later, volunteers to committees of this kind, if acting within their scope of work, are not subject to liability under Virginia code. Otherwise, none of us would ever agree to do any of this.
That's right.
And we work very hard to stay with that.
Just to clarify, the members of the ERC are no longer part of the case.
Yeah, this is Ken. I felt that her lawyers came perilously close to abusive process, simply putting us in the suit. Lawyers are supposed to know better than to sue somebody who is not suable, to put it in layman's terms.
All right. Thank you, Mark Gorey.
Sure.
Shall we move on to our second topic here, which is a presentation by Campbell and Lewis on Article 6 exceptions. And this really, really for our new members, this is kind of like a background in training, but I think it will benefit all of us. And we have all at different times had a lot of questions about these findings that we are required to address in our decisions. And so this, after Camelin gives her presentation, then we can ask, I would say, all the questions we want of Camelin, and if there are any we can't resolve, we'll do some research and get back. So let's turn it over to Camelin.
Hello, my name is Camelin, and yes, I'm going to speak to you today speak with you, I hope, about Chapter 118 and the parts which staff review, and then also the parts which the committee review. Is it possible to get some feedback to understand if you actually have a paper copy or some other copy that you can make notes of Chapter 118 on, just so that I can maybe help guide you for the future?
I have a paper copy.
This is Ed Monroe. I have a paper copy.
Okay, so I'm hoping you have something that you can at least make some notes. And it's an orientation more than anything else.
Okay.
And just to help you navigate 118. Sorry, I'm choking here for some reason. So I guess the key articles here are Article 3, Article 5, Article 6. I'm also going to speak about Article 2. Next slide. So really Article 5, which staff reviewed, and Article 6, here I've set out the different sections and tried to point out a key point here where there is some commonality. So you'll notice in Article 5, 11854, you have waivers for loss of buildable area. And then you'll notice in Article 6, 11867, exceptions for loss of buildable area. So Article 5, those sections there, 11851, 52, 53, 54, and 55 are reviewed by staff. And Article 6 is reviewed by the Exception Review Committee. Obviously, staff will write you a staff report and recommend some findings. In Article 6, you'll notice there 11861, 62, 63, 64, and 65 really set out the procedure and what needs to be submitted. Key section there, 11866, which we're going to go into in more depth, is the required findings. And then you really have those three categories, 67, 68, and 69, which are the types of exception that you'll be asked to review. Next slide. So I want to draw your attention also to Article 2 and to Article 3 with a view of what staff is reviewing. So in Article 2 is allowed uses. There are certain uses there which are kind of accepted uses. I want to get something else to look at here. The allowed uses, redevelopment types of things, water dependent uses. And then you'll see in 11832 and 11833, you'll see the performance criteria. That should say section 11832 and 11833. So the stormwater specialists are reviewing those sections 11851 through 11854, things which are exempt uses, loss of buildable area. And then section 11855, the minor additions, those are reviewed by staff, but through a different process. When somebody comes to get a building permit, they'll come to the county or submit it electronically at the present, and they'll ask for a permit. And along with the permitting process, the criteria for 11855 minor additions is reviewed, and then also an administrative water quality impact assessment is granted. Next slide. Something very key here, we want to make a note of it in section 11842. A water quality impact assessment is required unless it's actually an exempt use under 11851, or it's waived in accordance with the requirements in Article 6. And so I mentioned that there are some things in Article 2 which staff review. The water dependent uses, so for example, you have a stormwater outfall, that inherently is water dependent, the water needs to get into the stream. So those uses are considered allowed uses, and they're reviewed by staff under Article 2. Something that's redevelopment, if there's paved area on a lot already, they can tear it down and they can rebuild it. They can't make a further encroachment and they cannot increase the impervious area, but that's considered as redevelopment and it's allowed use. Under section 11851, no, not 11851, 11852, there are some roads and driveways, or roads, primarily public roads. And then under this Article 2, there are some additional roads and some additional driveways which are considered exempt, which staff can approve there also. And then another important thing, obviously water flows downhill, and so there's a need for regional flood control projects, and regional is very important here. It can't be just for an individual development. It needs to be for the benefit of a larger community, a regional flood control project. Those can all be approved under Article 2. Next slide. Water quality impact assessments, those are set out in Article 4, 11843. There have been some changes to the requirements for water quality impact assessments. In January this year, there was a new letter to industry which came out, and it set out the new requirements for water quality impact assessments. Matthew Hansen is supposed to be speaking on that later, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. Just let you know it came out in January and it became effective the beginning of March, the 2nd of March. So there is a potential that an application that started before that time, you may see, and it may be using the old criteria. You know, Matthew Hansen should speak to that later in this meeting. Next slide. This is just to show you that we have a form. If somebody submits something for staff review, and this is what it looks like. You can see obviously the different sections, 11851 through 55, and then 11833 there at the top. That's when you just have a water quality impact assessment, something that's an allowed use. Next slide. So let's look a bit more in depth then at Article 5. 11851, a use that was existing essentially before the RPA was established on the lot, can continue to be maintained, but you can't enlarge or expand it. If you do want to do that, you'd have to have a waiver or an exception. Public utilities and public roads, those are exempt uses. So those can be approved under Article 5.2. And then 11853, there are some additional exemptions. Generally speaking, passive recreation, things like trails would be approved within that section, and things like water wells would be approved. And there are certain criteria that they have to meet. I'm not going to go into those in detail, just know that they're there and you can read through those at your leisure. 11854, waivers for loss of buildable area. The key part here is staff can approve a waiver for loss of buildable area on a lot that was established before the RPA was designated, provided that the encroachment is not in the seaward 50 feet. If it is in the seaward 50 feet, then the Exception Review Committee or the Board of Supervisors must review that application. And then, as we mentioned, Section 11855, the minor additions, and that's approved through the walkthrough process. Next slide. A bit more depth. The minor additions. Key here is that the structure must have been on the lot before the RPA was designated. And the addition itself cannot create any more than 1,000 square feet of impervious area, or if it's a very large lot, the limit can actually go up to 2,500 square feet, and that's based on 2% of the lot area. Next slide. All of these waivers and exceptions have conditions, and these conditions and findings are very similar to the required findings that you have for the cases going to the committee. The minimum necessary to afford relief. We can't grant a special privilege, so somebody else that we deny, we cannot just go ahead and approve this one. We need to look at the harmony and intent. So the sections 11832 and 11833, like the performance criteria, those are very important when we review these applications. Can't be self-created or self-imposed, so we'll speak to more of this later, but you can't basically back yourself into a corner and force yourself to need to ask for an exception. The whole purpose of this is that we're trying to maintain water quality, and so conditions that will actually enhance water quality, those should be imposed. And obviously E&S is a requirement on all plans of development. So those are some conditions and findings which staff is looking for as we review and approve those applications. Next slide. As I mentioned, with regards to the lossable area here, the key part here is not in the seaward 50 feet. There's a limit there on the impervious area of 5,000 square feet and a limit on the disturbance of 10,000 square feet. As I said, the general concept here is the performance criteria, even though these criteria are listed, and we'll speak to more of that later. Just because you can have 5,000 square feet on the lot doesn't mean to say that that's necessarily appropriate. We need to look at what's actually in the neighbourhood and what's appropriate for the lot and look at the bigger picture. So those are set out in that section 1854. Next slide. So Article 6, as I mentioned earlier, the first part, 6.1, 6.2, 6.3, 6.4 and 6.5 are really the administrative parts on how this whole process works and what to submit. And 6.6, very key, the required findings, which we are going to go into more depth. And the 3 sections there, which you will have presented, something for loss of buildable area that does encroach into the seaward 50 feet. Exceptions for accessory structures, something that we learned here recently. We had in the past considered sheds not to be, in certain cases, that detrimental, may have been not considered to need to go to a hearing, but those have been, it's been determined that that is the case, that you'll see certain structures coming that you may not have seen in the past. But accessory structures must be reviewed by public hearing, either through the ERC or the Board of Supervisors. And then something which doesn't meet the criteria under 6.7 or 6.8 could potentially come to the committee under 6.9. And that section has a requirement for the water quality benefits to exceed the detriments. Next slide. So the required findings. I think perhaps we can talk about this now. I was thinking about saving it to the end of the presentation, but I think it really fits best here. May I get some feedback? Did the committee get a copy of the DCR guidance on these required findings?
Yes.
Okay. If there are members of the public or other people that don't actually have access to that already, they can go online. It is available online. It's publicly posted. If you go to the county's main webpage and type in the search bar Exception Review Committee, and the first item that will come up there is the Exception Review Committee. If you click on that link, and then you go halfway down the page, you will find the DCR exception on Chesapeake Bay preservation areas. I'm going to put a moment here in case somebody wants to go there. So the first finding then, the requested exception to the criteria is the minimum necessary to afford relief. So the minimum necessary to afford relief, you read through the guidance document here, is inherently subjective. And so this is one of the reasons we wanted to raise some of these required findings, so that before you're actually put on the spot to make a decision, you can consider some of these things for yourselves. And so if you read on in the guidance document here, it speaks to things like the size of the structure, the types of the proposed structure, placement of the structures in relation to the size, layout, location on the lot or parcel being important considerations. So staff, in looking at these cases, they look to see the properties within 500 feet of the subject property, which is also the limit of properties which need to be notified of a public hearing. Those are the properties which are deemed, if you like, to be perhaps affected most by this. Staff look at those properties to see what type of impervious area they have on the lot, the sizes of the homes, and compare those with the application that's on the table. We try and present that information to you to assist you in coming to some opinion about the minimum necessary to afford relief. A couple of other points within that paragraph that I perhaps could point out to you that you might want to consider. It talks about the extent that the applicant wishes to use the property, and it talks about alternative locations, sizing, or orientation options, which might limit the encroachment or perhaps even not need the encroachment into the resource protection area.
Camlin, do you want us to wait at the end, or do you want us to come in and make comments?
I'm okay if you want to make comments. I'm comfortable with that if that's what people would prefer.
Okay. I mean, the one that we've struggled with over and over is D, not self-created or self-imposed. It's very hard to know where the line is, which it's my property and I can do with it what I want, and a self-created or self-imposed situation. And I think, I mean, does anybody else have any other thoughts on this?
Can we wait until we get down? We are going to speak to that one too, so we could wait until we get to item D.
Okay.
Is there anything on this particular required finding, the minimum necessary to afford relief, that the committee would like to look into further or discuss further?
This is Dave Schneier. The harmony and intent, not the part having to do with water quality, but harmony with land use itself, is something we've talked about a rather great deal on some of these. And if there is further guidance, I know we looked to statements by the state on this matter, but if the staff has spent any time thinking about that and how they deal with it, because the criteria applies to them as well, it might be helpful to us to hear about that.
Okay, we have that one as item C. We've noted we'll go into that one here in just a moment again too. Anything on the minimum necessary to afford relief, item A? Not hearing anything back, then maybe let's move on then to the next required finding, which is the granting of the exception will not confer upon the applicant any special privileges to be denied by the clerk to other property owners who are subject to provisions and who are similarly situated. So I guess if you read in the guidance document here, the key item appears to be something that has been denied to others in similar situations. So staff look at past cases, and staff discuss the case which is on the table among each other in writing the staff report. So we try and collect together information which may have a bearing on the case for you and include that within the staff report. The objective here is to be equitable and fair, as we understand it.
Camlin, I think this is the one where you look to the past and the committee looks to the future, is that if we grant this one here, like we did on, like we just talked about on Woodlark or on Dead Run Drive, I mean, we know that there's a whole line lined up there of developers who, if we give the one the go, everybody else is going to, you know, do a push. And so, although we don't have any actual cases, I think that's what we sometimes have to think about, is not that we're denying them a privilege that somebody else has. It's that we're creating a precedent that we don't want to have to face in the future.
I think that's absolutely right. Obviously, staff look to the past, and if we see something that we should point out for the future, then obviously we would point anything out which we might seem to be, I think, is important for you to consider there. But obviously, the committee needs to consider that.
Well, this is Dave Schneer again. Let's be clear about this. Each of our decisions is supposed to be based on the evidence presented to us. Each decision is supposed to be unique and not precedent setting, even though, Ann, I appreciate your point, and we've talked about it and have seen it in the past. The way to get around it, to the degree that we need to, quote, get around it, is to simply be able to distinguish a decision we had made in the past with the one that happens to be before us at the time. And that distinguishing feature has to be sufficiently significant that a reasonable person would say those are different. It is in that way that I think we are in a position to be able to overcome a decision we might have made in the past and couch a decision we intend to make so as to not open the door wildly to activities that might happen in the future.
That's right. And those thought patterns and decisions need to be documented so that it's clear what is appertaining to the particular case on the table.
Yeah, this is Ken. I think that, like in the Woodlawn decision, we made our decision based on the facts of the case. Mm-hmm. Now, if some of those other properties were to come forward, then we have this case to fall back on. We didn't intend it as setting a precedent, but it certainly would affect a decision on the neighboring properties if they were to ask for the same thing we did not grant to this case.
I've got a question about C, harmony and intent, not detriment to water quality. I understand the not detrimental to water quality, but is there some subjective squishiness to that word harmony?
So I guess the exception request is in harmony with the purpose and intent of this part and not a substantial detriment to water quality. So I guess we are looking at the water quality impact assessment. And, you know, we spoke earlier about the criteria for those. There have been some changes to look at that more closely. Staff are looking at opportunities to enhance the existing RPA buffer and for best management practices that would also enhance water quality.
So this is Betsy, and I've always had some difficulty with condition C because, you know, the wording is that it said it is not of substantial detriment to water quality. But in any given lot, you know, these little lots that come before us, any single one of them is unlikely to be substantial in kind of the larger scheme of things. And it's always seemed kind of very subjective and really too subjective because the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Ordinance also talks about the need to consider cumulative impacts. And if you keep allowing people to develop within the RPA, then the overall effect is certainly a substantial impact on water quality. And yet each individual decision may not be. So I've always had a hard time, and I don't find the DCR guidance very helpful. I mean, all it does is point us to the water quality impact assessment, which in the past the water quality impact assessments have also not been terribly helpful in terms of actually communicating what risks a particular project poses to water quality.
Let me suggest, this is David Schneider, let me suggest a parallel condition. It doesn't apply exactly on our side of the continent, but does apply on the west side. And it's this concept that there is a hierarchy of water uses in the West. You have to have, if you're not first in line and the guy who's first in line takes all the water, you're out of luck. In large measure, this is also true if you have, for example, a series of properties in a row on a stream where the first one does not in and of itself necessarily cause a detriment to the water quality. But when the next one comes along, it's possible to say, well, I'm sorry you weren't first. Had you been, we might have viewed it differently, but it is the cumulative effect of you and the guy upstream from you that is sufficient to cause us to say that it is detrimental to water quality. And so the fact is, two pieces of property, even if they're right next to each other, are not the same piece of property. They don't have the identical characteristics. And if one of them has already been developed and has used up the ability, it's a term I'm looking for, and my mind's slipping, the assimilative capacity of the stream bed, well, that's it. It's been used up. And so all we need to do is come to that conclusion if that's true. And then we've dealt with the detriment that comes along with the latter use.
This is Ken. I don't quite agree with that approach of sequential use. It's a Western concept and we don't use it here. What I see is that in passing the Chesapeake Bay Ordinance and establishing the resource protection areas, Fairfax has claimed a certain degree of improvement in water quality. Now, different things when we touch that resource protection area, different actions will have changes in water quality, some of them good, some of them bad. We can only know that statistically. There's a whole background of literature that tell us whether planting trees or doing something else or ponds or whatever will affect water quality, and we can quantify that statistically. It varies a lot for individual properties, but nevertheless, I mean, I look at the approach as saying, okay, we're at a certain level of protection. You must not do anything to bring us in a worse position. The bay has to come out at worst even, preferably ahead of anything you intend to do.
I have another thought that I might let you ponder, and that is we have a section there, 11851, existing non-conforming uses. Fairfax County is perhaps different to some of the other Bay states in that a lot of these stream valleys already have lots already designated along them. These lots being designated in the 50s and 60s, some of them far earlier than that. And these lots are essentially a home with lawn. And so you're looking at a situation where you had a nice lawn and somebody comes and they want to do something different on the lot. Maybe they want a larger house. Maybe they want something different. And in so doing that, are they prepared to give up that huge area of lawn and make a significant part of it wooded so that they can have maybe a slightly larger home? What is the net balance there of what's happening to water quality? And then we have new technologies, we have best management practices. and that's always been a requirement in the water quality impact assessment, best management practices to offset like the taking of the resource protection area. So we could envision a scenario there where we would not have much detriment to water quality. We could have a significant improvement to water quality over what would be allowed for them to continue to use their property under Section 11851.
That's very well stated. That's pretty much exactly what I intended to say. And yes, in terms of actually making things better, because there's so much uncertainty on any individual best management practice on a specific place, in many states, the practice has been to require the target improvement, change in water quality to be maybe more positive than simply breaking even, just to cover the uncertainty there.
I'd like to just make a point on this particular criteria. I think the criteria is two-part, right? There's an and in there. So the first part is that whatever the exception is, the request for the encroachment has to be in harmony with the purpose and intent of the ordinance or that part of the ordinance. And then secondly, it can't cause a substantial detriment to water quality. So you can deny, or it has to meet both of those criteria in order to satisfy that provision. That makes sense. So I agree with the comment that on a lot by lot analysis, it's going to be difficult to show that an improvement or an encroachment is going to cause a substantial detriment to water quality. But you can also look to the overall harmony and intent of the ordinance or that part of that article of the ordinance in order to analyze whether the encroachment is permissible.
Well, that's helpful, I think. And actually, I question, Cameron, whether the idea of turning a lot that is currently turf grass and saying, okay, well, it would be okay to build a house there if you put part of the house of the lot into wooded area. To me, that does not seem compatible with the harmony and intent of the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Ordinance, which is to establish buffers around the streams. So I think that seems a very strained argument to me.
So this is Ed Monroe. I was just going to say, from my understanding, there was an improvement to this guidance because Fairfax County has come out with this water quality impact assessment application that is more specific. I don't know whether staff wants to speak to it, but I'm looking at it, and I know, before this came out with a letter to industry, there may be a case or two that would not require this, but we seem to have, as a county, improved upon this already in providing some more clarity through the new documentation in the impact assessment application. Would that be correct to assume?
I think there's more clarity, yes. I think Matthew Hanson will speak more to that later, and we can have more of a discussion about the water quality impact assessment and your requirements later on. I don't want to completely stop the review, if you like, of the required findings. But yes, we do have some more clarity.
This is Ken. There's actually been quite a bit of research in recent years on non-point runoff, specifically in the Piedmont area. They've done a lot in the Baltimore area. USGS has a big program there. And there's also been quite a bit in North Carolina. So the science is getting better as to what, on the average, going from one use of land to another use of land, what will happen on water quality. It's better, it's more defensible. And of course, it's again, strictly what you expect, not what you get on a specific site.
If we don't have any more thoughts at this time on that section, maybe we can move on to D, self-created or self-imposed. In the guidance document, it speaks to the actions of the property owner and draws the analogy that this finding is somewhat similar to the first finding, the minimum necessary to afford relief. It speaks to things like the size of the home in relation to the size of the lot. The 7,000 square foot home on a 10,000 square foot lot may not be particularly appropriate, and speaks to the issue of the property perhaps not being suited for the intended use. And so it is, again, very subjective. But is there any comment or discussion or question on this section?
Well, as I said before, this is Ann Cantor. This is, I think, where the rubber hits the road. This is, people want to do stuff and they don't think it's self-created, or self-imposed. They think, I've got to have a swimming pool in the floodplain. I've got to have that. And and so that's where the committee really runs up against the emotional problems with a lot of the applicants who come before us. And it's hard to be real strict on this, saying, no, it's self-imposed, build a smaller house. Now, through long trial and many long afternoons and all this other stuff, it looks like on Woodlark, they're finally doing that, but it takes a lot of work sometimes when we're looking at an applicant, and because I don't think it's our job to redo the applicant's submission. I think it's our job to say, okay, this is what you submitted, but getting them, saying no to them is hard, and it takes a long time sometimes for them to say, you just can't do it on the lot you have.
I want to remind those who were involved at the time, and let someone who hasn't been know about it. When the Woodlark thing came forward and we met with then Chairman Bulova, who was very familiar with those properties, her almost immediate comment was, nobody should be building houses down there. That was never intended. And in fact, the developer put in the requirements in large measure because it appeared anyway that that whole area was intended to be just trees and wetland, and that was their intent. Now, we can't always determine the intent, but I don't think that means that we shouldn't attempt to do so in a reasonable manner. And in that reason, being able to come into them as we did in the Woodlark case and say, look, a smaller house might work, but not this one, is something that we haven't had to do very often, but I think is something clearly within our authority to do, and we should do from time to time.
So this is Betsy. For me, this condition raises another issue that sort of I've never really quite gotten my head around properly, which is a lot of times when we're brought in to approve with a request, it'll turn out to be a lot that has a violation on it, or there was a previous RPA approval of an incursion and they didn't meet the conditions of the granting of the exception, like that swimming pool case, where they were supposed to plant. They had a planting area and it had never been planted. And I can't remember all of the other parts of the violation. They'd expanded their driveway. To me, there's something wrong with us convening accepting a request for another exception and having a public hearing about it when they are in violation of a previous exception that was granted. And to me, it just goes right against this condition here. And to me, there seems something wrong about somebody coming in and, I mean, should we even be hearing a request when they haven't met the conditions of a previous one or in violation of the
Betsy, I remember that one. And if you remember when the owner said, oops, I forgot to do this. As a civil engineer, I pointed out that oops is a very bad word. I mean, terrible things happen, okay? And ultimately what we had to do there is we imposed some pretty strict lay your money down to guarantee it conditions before they could proceed.
Yeah. No, I felt like we handled it as best we could. And who knows, it may even end up improving water quality if they actually do it this time. But there is something wrong with a process that kind of allows an applicant to come in repeatedly and not fulfill the terms of the prior exception and come in and want another one. And
the problem that we have with that is that we haven't been given the authority to take that into consideration.
Yeah.
And I think the solution to that is for us to send a formal letter to the board explaining this problem and asking that they address it somehow. And there's two ways to do it. One, that we could just say the application's incomplete because they're in violation. We're not going to accept any application in current violation. Or the other is to have the staff, authorize the staff to do exactly that. But our problem has been in the past that we don't have the authority to consider that. I don't believe we do anyway. Now, Mark may be able to inform us more on that, but I really don't believe that we do.
That property where there had been a violation is quite close to where I live, and I've driven by, but I have to wait until all the leaves are off the tree. I can't quite see into the yard and see if they've done any of the stuff that they were supposed to do, but I'll go by in the next couple of weeks and see what they've done.
I may have something else for you to think about. And I guess if somebody comes to ask for an exception or ask for something, in the same way that they may go to the counter to get a slice of cheese, so they go to the counter, the first person goes up and they ask for a slice of cheese and they get a slice of cheese. The second person goes to the counter and they ask for 5 slices of cheese. And so it's considered that what they asked for, the 5 slices with cheese, were reasonable. So the first person comes back and says, you know, I really should have asked for 2 slices of cheese. Could I have another slice of cheese? And I guess the question there is, would you have approved it the first time around or not? I think that's really a big question that staff have. Would it have been approved if they'd come and asked? And that would be a key test for us. If they asked for something or they did something that we wouldn't have approved, I think we would not look on that favorably. But if it had been something that, had they come and asked and it was a genuine mistake, maybe that should be looked at differently. Maybe Mark, would you have any more comments that you might add to such a comment or thought?
Are you speaking in the context of a violation and coming in to the either staff or to the ERC to either accept the encroachments or to modify the encroachments that were a violation of the ordinance. Is that what you're asking,
Yes.
Kimberly?
Yes.
So our position is that the applicant or the homeowner, the property owner, is entitled to submit a request for either a waiver or an exception as necessary. But staff and the ERC should not view the encroachment as they should treat the encroachment as if it were being submitted for the first time. In other words, they shouldn't pay any deference to that encroachment or that violation. They should review the application as if it were coming to them without having been implemented at all. So let's suppose someone builds a patio that encroaches in the RPA without permission, and county staff goes out and issues a notice of violation. In order to comply with the ordinance, it will have to submit a WQIA, and staff should review that WQIA as if it's being proposed in the absence of it being actually constructed, if that makes sense. So if it can be approved and it's something that would normally be approved, then yes, they can grant that waiver. The exception should be granted. But if there are things, if it needs to be reduced in size, or there have to be other improvements or plantings made in order to make it, in order for it to satisfy the ordinance, then staff or the ERC should make those conditions of the approval. So the violation is not considered a self-created or self-imposed condition.
Thank you. That's helpful. I guess.
This is Ken. Here's how I would define.
Go ahead.
Here's how I would define a self-created condition. You come in and you build a house right against the RPA, and you like the house, and then later you decide you want a swimming pool, and the only place to put it that makes any sense is in the RPA. That to me is a self-created condition. Whereas if you had thought about where you're going to put your swimming pool when you first built your house, you would have had plenty of options to put it outside of the RPA. And that to me is the simplest example I see of self-created conditions.
I agree with Ken on that. With regard, though, to the prior violation issue, if we're going to do an application as though it was just an original application, and we know that they have failed to do something they should have done in the past, the way I personally view it is, I presume that they will meet the requirements of what they've done in the past. We can notify code enforcement, let them deal with it. But the presumption is that they will do what they said they were going to do previously, and we may have conditions to put on top of that. On the other hand, if having not done what they should have done, they come in with a new plan that is equal to doing the old one and doing the necessary improvements that we would expect, then that's fine too, either one.
Shouldn't we approve of something that's sort of provable? You know, if a new application comes in and it meets all the current criteria that you're looking for, you shouldn't worry about any things that they didn't do in the past. The new one meets the criteria and it should move forward, right?
Sam, this is Ken. I think the new one should meet all the criteria, including what was imposed in the past and not done. I would agree with you there. If they've got a new way of doing it, it's better. Ultimately, I think we have to look at the interest of the bay.
Yeah.
If the bay comes out better, there's not a lot of people going to say we're not doing our job.
what I was getting at there is that if the new application includes the old one, and we think the whole project is acceptable, and I'm not sure if our role is to judge whether it was done in the first place. Shouldn't that be the code enforcement to take care of issues like that?
Well, here's an example. When we had this swimming pool case, they had a planting area that was identified as kind of mitigation, as I recall. And it turned out it was the exact same spot where they had been previously supposed to plant for their previous RPA exception, but they'd never planted it. So they were basically proposing the same thing, not as mitigation for the new, but the mitigation they were supposed to have performed before. And so to me, that didn't seem okay. You know, they should do what they were supposed to do before, and they should also add some more to it to mitigate the new encroachment that they were proposing and asking for permission for.
Yeah, Betsy, I think the new proposal actually had a larger mitigation area, but I agree that much of it was stuff that should have been done the first time. The way I kind of look at it is they've said, okay, let us put the pool in and we'll do something to take care of it. And I have an obligation to judge the trustworthiness of that promise. In most cases, you know, if we haven't had any prior experience to say something's wrong, I would say, fine, let's go ahead. They've promised this, let's assume they'll do it. But in this case, we had good reason from past experience not to trust them to do it this time. And so that's why I voted for, like everybody did, for making them put their money down before they got approval.
I remember going out there and talking to the woman who owned the thing. And they had just cut down. They had just clear cut right to the edge of the bank. I don't know how many trees. I mean, dozens and dozens of large trees, because they wanted to put a lawn down there, and they'd done it without any permission of any kind. And that too came to our attention, and we said that's got to be remediated. And so when we looked at the whole plan, as I recall, basically said they got to do as much as they would have had to have done previously and should have done, plus more. And that's where we ended up.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we should move on because we got stuff to do. All right.
Yes.
Yes, move on.
Okay, Kamala, you want to take up condition finding E?
Finding E, something that I guess the water quality issue here. Reasonable and appropriate conditions are imposed as warranted that will prevent the allowed activity from causing a degradation of water quality. You read in the guidance document there, it talks about stormwater management BMP requirements to compensate for the loss of pollutant removal aspect of the RPA. And this is mentioned, as I said, in the water quality impact assessment requirements, best management practices to offset like the loss of RPA buffer. It goes on in the guidance document to talk about additional vegetative plantings elsewhere on the lot or parcel to boost the functions of the undisturbed RPA. So obviously, we're thinking about the concept of where somebody had, if you like, the right under an existing non-conforming use to maintain that buffer as lawn. Maybe you could claim some of that back, but then maybe areas outside the resource protection area boundary line that you may get some other vegetation, vegetated buffer areas there that you could divert runoff through that would filter water And you can also have other best management practices. Obviously, ideally, we want those outside of the resource protection area. We don't want to cut down trees to put in a rain garden, but that seems to make no logical sense. But maybe there would be some other types of facilities like planter boxes, which are becoming quite popular these days, that you can divert the roof runoff through and get some additional water quality benefit before it actually makes its way on down through the RPA and to the stream. So there are some considerations there in that finding. Is there anything there that somebody wants to expand upon?
I think you've got it exactly right there. One technique we have not looked at enough, I feel, is stream restoration. And we certainly missed that on the Great Falls property, although they claimed it would be horrendously expensive, and it is costly. But I feel if you really want to improve the water quality, they had a stream that was eroding into a gully there, and I would have loved to have seen them take care of that.
Stream restorations get a little bit tricky sometimes. Do you address it right at the outset, or do you let a lot of what you call rules and regulations try to govern what you have to do? You know, some of these things need to be addressed very quickly, and our system seems to slow it down to a point that by the time you actually get to it and following all the conditions, the stream is degraded even more. You know, if there's a restoration, there's a quicker way to do it. We need to think about that, or the stream restoration should be dealt with slightly differently. But the current way of doing it, you've got to do a lot of applications and permissions and stuff like that, and it goes on forever.
Well, Sam, we could hold a big seminar on stream restoration. As you probably know, it's still a very controversial topic. But Fairfax County has actually had quite a bit of success in stream restoration. In fact, I hear that they've told EQAC that if they wanted to simply protect the bay, $1 spent on stream restoration is worth $10 on any other technique. It's enormously more effective, but it's not cheap in itself. It costs about $1,200 a linear foot. And they use, if you're familiar with the technique, Roskin level 4, which is pretty serious restoration. And above all, you can't just do it piecemeal. You have to pick a whole length of stream and work on that.
What was that word, Ken? Röntgen?
David Roskin is the guy who developed this natural channel design technique, is what it's called. And I've talked to Roskin. I've actually published some of his work in my former career. And he's quite a character. And most people in fluvial morphology are very outspoken, one way or the other. There's two camps. And it's amazing. But more and more, as we get more experience, whatever the theoretical lackings of his technique that he teaches, it's proving itself to be pretty worthwhile, especially in Fairfax County. We've had very good experience with that technique, and certainly can justify using it here.
I don't want to divert too far into this. I want to get back to the findings, but Ken, is the evidence on the Fairfax County stream restorations published anywhere or summarized in a report that you know of?
I will look for a formal report. It's Kate, who's in charge of stormwater? Kate, oh, the name slips me right now. I'll have to look up my notes.
Maybe we could.
You're thinking of Kate Bennett, and she's no longer with the county. She's no longer with the county.
Oh, that's a loss. She was really good. But I believe she had quite a good organization behind her. So I don't know who's following up right now.
Heather Ambrose replaced her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the county is actually one of the leaders in stream restoration. The only limit we have on it is not enough money.
Well, and in some cases, it has been hugely controversial. There was a case down in my part of the world that just erupted into terrible acrimony. But let's get back to the conditions.
Okay, the last one there, other findings, that really comes back when you talk about cases submitted under 11869, which require that there be a water quality benefit to the exception request. So I think we're through the required findings. Let's move on to the next slide. So exceptions for loss of buildable area, as you've already mentioned, the key piece here is that those come to the committee when they want to come or encroach into the seaward 50 feet. The limitations there of no more than 10,000 square feet of land disturbance and 5,000 square feet of impervious area are the same as the limitations which staff would have. As I said, the key piece here is that they come to the committee if they're in the seaward 50 feet. All the other things, the validity of the lot and the buffer and the performance requirements, those are all the same sort of considerations. And again, those required findings which we went into great depth before. So next slide. 11868, accessory structures. The key piece here is that the principal structure on the lot must have been before the RPA was designated on the lot. And the accessory structure cannot be more than 1,000 square feet, except when you have situations where you have large lots where it can go up to 2,500 square feet based on a 2% calculation on the lot size. Those are all similar criteria there on the recordation of the lot and looking for the buffers and the water quality not to be impacted in a serious way. Next slide. 6.9, as we'd already mentioned earlier, a key piece here that the required finding is that the water quality benefits exceed the detriments. And obviously all the required findings in section 6.6, which we went into at great depth on, also needs to be met. Next slide. In looking at these cases and the water quality issue, we frequently ask the applicant to submit the Virginia runoff reduction spreadsheet and looking, if you like, at the change in water quality based on the land use before and the land use afterwards. That spreadsheet is based on the simple equation, which is just looking at the phosphorus runoff from the turf, forest and impervious cover. And that simple calculation, which is presented for you there.
Karen, where do these these coefficients come from? I mean, are there standardized, agreed upon charts for what the runoff coefficients for the different types of land are?
I think the answer to that question is there are agreed upon, if you like, coefficients. Those numbers are agreed upon. That's embedded in, if you like, in the Virginia runoff reduction spreadsheet, and this simple equation, which is the basis, as I understand it, of that. There is a lot of research where those coefficients were derived. I don't know the depth of that and the research and how that was done and who did it. If you need that information, we can find the papers for that, but I don't have the underlying papers where those coefficients were derived. It's accepted mythology.
Kamala, this is in the Virginia standards, isn't it, somewhere by DEQ?
Yeah.
The Virginia runoff reduction method is the Virginia standard method that's required when anybody submits a site plan to the county or within Virginia. They have to use that method, and the underlying equation is this equation, as I understand it, which is used for all of these calculations. And they did the research, so I don't know the depth of the research that they did in coming up with this.
Yeah, I think unless we had our own specific research, we'd be in very poor standing if we tried to use something else to compute it. But I admit that Virginia should periodically be looking at their standards, and I hope that they are.
This is taken into.
Sorry. These things are updated occasionally. They change very slightly, for calculation purposes. And if you've used it in the past, you'll notice that some of the numbers have changed because of the overall. There's more modern ways of measuring it. So some fancy department does all these researches. They put little weirs everywhere, and they do all these little calculations in the river, and they come up with these numbers, and they modify it because you can measure it more accurately now.
Okay. Yeah, well, the ones in my textbooks are 25 years old, so I was just wondering if they've changed a lot.
I think no engineer would use the textbook they learned on unless they're very, very young.
So does this method take into account sort of site-specific features like the slope and the soils and things like that?
It's based on land use, and those parameters, the details of those, I don't. And Sam, it sounds like Sam, you know more about this than I perhaps do. I don't see that written in that equation.
It's not written there. These things, you get a value from this equation, and then you apply it to another one that also somehow takes slope into account, and it calculates velocity at the end of the day, and based on the water velocities, it just I haven't done this in a very, very long time, so I'm quite rusty at this, but I do know that everything gets taken into account, and like if it's a heavily forested area, they expect the water to be flowing through that very slowly, and those are the factors that you see in this formula. So they've come up with a research numbers, and they give you the numbers to use, and if you use those numbers, they're quite conservative, and they seem to work well, and they have improved the situation quite a lot.
No, but you're saying this is only one of the equations that would be submitted as part of this method?
Yeah. This is one calculation that you do there, but there are other things that would bring you to this point as well.
Yeah, Betsy, as I remember my textbooks is they had land use type like turf, and then they had degrees of slope within that. So you found your coefficient for both your land type and the degree of slope in the to create the coefficient. And green turf grass that had a steep slope was commonly known as green asphalt because water ran over it, just about as sheeted over it, but just about as fast as it did over a parking lot.
Yeah, okay. That seems to be the key for us is, our forested space is going to be the best in terms of keeping water on site, managing the water.
Yeah, I think as far as the calculation goes, most engineering firms today would work off a GIS. Fairfax County, by the way, has incredibly good data on slope through its LIDAR effort. And so mostly you can get the GIS coverages from the county, plug them into your site, and I believe there's probably an app that does this whole thing for you.
Yeah, Fairfax County now requires everybody to assume that if you're developing new land, you've got to take it back to historic condition to where it was all forested. So you can't say, well, there's turf there now. I can assume that water was already running at that speed. You shall slow it down, assuming that it is forested, and and if you can't meet that criteria, then you start holding back water in terms of ponds and stuff within your property, and letting it flow into the stream at prehistoric rates, not prehistoric, but what forested rates, as they call that.
Sam, what you just said, Fairfax County having this policy on developing new land and returning it to that condition, where is that written down?
I can't tell you offhand. I'll have to look that up. It's in the.
Well, it's important for us to know for land use, and I'm thinking that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I think maybe I can add a little bit of light to that. When it comes to runoff, Chapter 124 of the County Code is based on the state regulations, and that specifies there what has to be done in terms of quantity and quality of runoff from the land. I think that's really where you want to go back to Chapter 124. That is a whole different conversation to what we have.
I understand. Yeah, I understand it is, as is tree cover, as is what Tree Commission is doing. I understand that, but I'd like to read it. Thank you.
So I guess maybe we'll move on a little bit here. I just want to show you one more slide. Next slide. This is just the application form that's used if somebody submits something for the Exception Review Committee. So it just sets out which section they're actually applying under. And then the next slide. I think we've had a lot of discussions, so maybe there won't be too many questions, but if you have some before, I think the next presentation is, Danielle, is that right? Matthew Hansen in the Water Quality Impact Assessment?
Yeah, that's correct.
So are there any questions before I hand it over to Matthew to speak about the Water Quality Impact Assessment? Okay, Daniel, do you want to hand it over to Matthew?
Sure, let me just pull up his presentation real quick. I'm going to stop sharing and then I'll switch to the next presentation.
Thank you, Camelin. That's very useful.
Thank you.
Okay. Matt, you're welcome to present whenever you're ready. The PowerPoint is up. Let me see here if you're muted.
Matt is muted.
That is muted. Okay. Down here, let's see. Matt, can you oh, are you, oh, it just keeps unmuting. Well, I keep trying to unmute him and it just keeps muting again.
Is he in as an attendee? Can you convert him to a participant?
He is a panelist right now, so he should be able to unmute himself and speak. So I'm not exactly sure what's happening here.
Am I muted?
Who's speaking right now? Oh,
Jim Chesley.
No, you are not muted.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
All right, I'm back, Danielle.
Oh, there you are. Okay, wonderful.
I tried to change my my video background to just a simple blur or nothing, and I went ahead and crashed the window. So slightly embarrassed. I had this background up for a previous meeting. It's distracting, and I apologize for that, but I won't try to change it again at risk of crashing the application. Let's get started. Water quality impact assessments. I'm here today to tell you about the application form and the process and some updates to that over the course of the last year. So Chair Martin and members of the committee, thank you for having me. Several members of this committee will recall I was involved in the Woodlark case early on. And for other members of this committee who I'm meeting for the first time today, I work now in the infill development branch, so I haven't been staffing stormwater cases lately. Next slide, Danielle. So of course you hear these exceptions as Camelin presented with the criteria she presented. The process of a water quality impact assessment comes before these applications make it to your committee. The water quality impact assessment is required for staff to deem it complete before the application is forwarded to the ERC. This was a particular point of difficulty in the staff process where in years past we had proceeded to schedule applications with the ERC immediately upon receipt. So we have interpreted that a complete application using this text of 118 means that a WQIA is itself generally acceptable. It's responsive to all of the criteria in the ordinance. So the process an applicant will go through now is to turn in that water quality impact assessment, and not until staff gives a favorable review and says, yes, all of the components are here, your application is complete. Not until that happens does the application get forwarded to the ERC. So that's how we're using this section of 118 now. That 90 days of receipt is after the WQIA has been looked at the first time, so that staff isn't put in a position of having a very incomplete or non-responsive WQIA and having also scheduled it for your time, which isn't a good use of your time, ours, or the applicants. So we trust that that's an improvement in the process. The application form is new this year. It was early 2020. We put together a new water quality impact application form. And the real meat of this is in the letter to industry that accompanied it, not just the form itself. So give me the next slide, Danielle. What we previously had was Chapter 118, and that was about all the guidance that the public or staff had about what a WQIA is. That led to a wide range in interpretations by our applicants of what needed to be in the WQIA. Especially at the smallest end of the scale, homeowner with a very small use, perhaps something so small wouldn't come to this committee, the criteria would appear too onerous. And for the most intense uses, the categories described in 118.4 just weren't specific enough to tell the applicants what we need to see in that WQIA. So we went ahead and I hyperlinked this slide, thinking I might be presenting it, and I could just pull up that technical bulletin and present from it. So Danielle, could you do that?
Did that work? Can you see the?
That works. I see the technical bulletin.
It's awful small.
I'll speak in generalities to it. I don't think any particular set of words. We're not going to read through the whole thing, I promise you. So bring us down, Danielle, to the first attachment. So this is what I said the meat of the WQIA letter to industry is. We've taken and turned into a table and tried to elaborate on the text of the code. So the general information is going to appear in the application form, of course, and for a other elements of the code. Go ahead and scroll down, Danielle. We take it through paragraph by paragraph of the ordinance and explain exactly what needs to be shown on a drawing and what should be included in a narrative, so that it is less less folks just making up their particular firm's template for a narrative. And we wanted to lay out exactly what folks should be responsive to. So I won't read all of this to you, but this is what the applicants should see before starting to prepare their WQIA. All right, back to the slide, if you would, Danielle. One other major difference, I shouldn't use that word, I'm about to define major and minor. One of the most important updates with this technical bulletin is the differentiation of major and minor water quality impact assessments. This is something that neighbor jurisdictions have in their ordinances. So we looked around. Stafford comes to mind as one who had this written in, and there are others. We don't. We have just 118.4. So with this technical bulletin, we establish major and minor water quality impact assessment categories. Both are responsive to the criteria of 118.4, but for those major uses, and then the criteria are a bit more in-depth than the minor uses. Minor uses have some strict criteria for amount of land disturbance allowable and amount of impervious area in the RPA proposed, where someone would get to come in on that slightly easier minor WQIA form. The minor WQIA is intended to be the application form only and a site drawing. The major WQIA, which should be most similar to the WQIAs you've seen with applications to your committee, the major WQIA has a full topographic survey as a requirement and several more narrative and technical requirements to be included in addition to the application form. This doesn't apply to a few key items. That's minor additions, which have their own exception written into 118.5.5 for small additions to single-family residences, and does not apply to removal of invasive species or vegetation management, which has its own application form that staff processes at the administrative level. Next slide, Danielle. The major versus minor. Minor WQAs were meant mostly for the homeowner with a small project, not for the sort of work that would come before this committee. Minor WQAs less than 256 square feet, nothing in the seaward 50 feet, and less than 2,500 square feet of land disturbance in the RPA. All right. Next slide, Danielle. Trying to be more accessible to the homeowner was one of our goals of minor WQIA. That is, you might find it for accessory structures. There is no criteria to distinguish between major and minor for accessory structures. So, we're an applicant to turn in a WQIA for, say, a shed outside of the seaward 50 feet of the RPA. What this committee would see is a minor WQIA, including the application form and some basic site drawing, but not necessarily a topographic survey of the lot. Most of your applications will follow the criteria of the major WQIA. Next slide, Danielle. And that's it. I hope the application form and the new technical bulletin lead to more responsive WQIAs that come before this committee, and hopefully a more standardized approach than some WQAs that have been submitted in the past. So that's all I have for you today. Much more brief than Camelin. She's a hard act to follow, so I will field any questions you might have about that.
Thank you, Matt. I had a question or two, and others may also. Let's see, now I have to find where my question is. I was wondering, will the minor WQIA have to describe any fill that will be put in the RPA?
If fill is a proposed use of that WQIA, it should be described in that document, yes. So if the requested use is fill, absolutely, they should be speaking to it. There is a fair amount of discretion. If somebody was stretching the boundaries of what we thought was appropriate for minor WQIA, and it was obvious that a topographic survey should support the application to describe it, this is just a policy of the Department of Land Development Services, and we could insist upon someone meeting those major WQIA criteria if it was appropriate for any given case.
The other thing that seemed odd to me, which was the description, this would be a major WQIA, which had to do with locations of septic drain fields in the RPA. And I was a little shocked to think that the county would allow septic drain fields in an RPA. And so I was just wondering, I don't remember that being in previous, I don't remember that ever being a case or an issue, but maybe it was.
You know, I had not thought of drain fields in the RPA before starting this process of drafting this. I did read similar requirements in other jurisdictions' codes that this wastewater element should be proposed. So the language here is paraphrased more or less out of Stafford County's and others' definitions of what is a major WQIA in their ordinances. It seemed better than not to have it here to indicate to people if you're going to request an exception to put a drain field in the RPA, here are some things you should talk about in your WQIA. Drain fields are actually not prohibited in the RPA. They can be processed as a loss of buildable area request, and they are, for obvious reasons, not a good idea to put them in the RPA. And if at all possible, there should be other space on a lot to put those. If there is other space, it's staff's job, or I would hope by the time we choose this committee that all other options have been exhausted for placement of the drain field.
And the revised WQIA does look a lot more informative and the requirements seem more consistent. So that's a very good thing, I think.
I didn't flash the application form up on screen, but it is our hope that the application form, especially for the homeowners who have to navigate this process for simple and small projects that are entitled to an exception, but they just have to go through the WQIA process, that they can walk through the form, and it leads the average homeowner in a way that may result in them being able to do it themselves and not having to come in and have a meeting with staff about it.
Well, the major WQIA is improved as well. More specific and clear and a little more demanding too, I think.
The process as it went forward to result in this was a policy committee. Matthew served on, as did I, and took up all of these kinds of questions. It was then we discovered, for example, the shed was subject to ERC review if it was within the 50 level. And so the whole intent was to have the staff develop an application form that was sort of truncated for the small user, but robust enough for the large development. And I think in large measure, they've succeeded well.
It looks good.
Yeah, I appreciate having this, the technical bulletin too, because I frankly never really understood quite what was on a WQIA and how to read it. And this has given me a lot of reference. So when I see them in the future, I'll be better able to apply them as, put them in as part of the picture. Thank you.
Well, good. You're welcome, and I hope it's useful to you. I'll share that the latest WQIA I read myself several months ago still adhered to what looked like an old templates that a firm might have had developed. I believe it was common and it is still for folks to turn in their narrative in a combined fashion where they try to speak to the exception criteria and the required narrative to say that they've met those required findings and the WQA criteria. I've read a lot of WQAs in the past where they're just meshed into one large narrative, and that certainly confused me when I was learning our process. And I hope in the future we see them separated a little, that the exception narrative goes with the exception application, and we get a cleaner WQA that's easier to just read side by side with the criteria and match up and say if they meet them or not.
Oh,
Well,
good.
thank you,
It wasn't
Matt.
just me. It wasn't just me then. Huh?
Not at all. All right. Well, thank you all for your time. If you have any follow-up questions, reachable by email, or you can invite me back to this committee whenever you like.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks for
Matthew,
your
this is
briefing.
Ken. This is
Hi,
Ken.
Ken.
Remember the question we're going to ask you when you come before us or any of your colleagues come before us. Is the Bay better off with us approving this application, or is it worth it? The ultimate question comes down to that. And that's where we appreciate the help.
Oh, you're most welcome. Thank you, Ken.
All right, so let's see. I believe we are at our final topic, which is our next meeting date. I don't think we can set a meeting date quite yet, can we? Danielle and Randy?
Not yet. I think Cameron might know more than me, but I think we're still waiting for the applicant to finish some things before we can set the date.
This is Brandy with staff. I can confirm that we're expecting potentially 2 exception applications, but the dates have not been finalized yet. And when we developed the agenda, we weren't sure if one would be finalized in time. So that's why that placeholder is there, but we do not have one to bring before you yet to set a date.
Okay, thank you. And now I guess, unless anybody has any other comments they want to make for the good of the group, I move to adjourn the meeting.
I second. Excuse me.
All right. I confirm that Ann Cantor seconded the motion. The motion is moved and seconded. Any discussion of the motion to adjourn? Hearing no discussion, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed say nay. Have it. The motion carries. Thank you all very much. It's good to see you again, and it was a very useful presentations by Cameron and Matt. And it's nice to welcome our new member. And I hope the rest of you have a very good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Beth.
To our staff.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Happy holidays.
You too. Bye.
Leave event.